Hello, this is going to be a very brief overview of Shakespeare's life and also some background information for The Tempest. This is just supposed to get us a framework of who we're talking about and where we are going. Alright, so here's a little mini biography about Shakespeare. We're not sure of his exact birth date, but there is record that he was baptized on April 26, 1564. They usually did those a few days after birth, so it's possible that he was born on April 23rd, 1564. This is the most accepted date. This is also St. George's Day in England. St. George is the patron saint of England, and it was a time of celebration. He was born and raised in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is about 100 miles outside of London. So his hometown was basically in the country, in the rural area. Even despite that, though, he had a very rigorous early education. Lots of Latin texts and things like that. So even though he grew up in the sticks, he did have an extensive education. He married Anne Hathaway in 1582, and they had 3 children. 2 of those were twins. And then from 1585 to 1592, there's very little information about Shakespeare and what he was doing. This is possible because at the time, playwrights, unless they were being scandalous, weren't exactly something you would read about in the tabloids or the news or whatever. So this is possible that there's very little info because he was boring. Also, this span of time where we don't really hear much has led to speculation that Shakespeare didn't write all of his works, but that's not true. Because considering his background and everything else, just because there's a few years missing, that doesn't mean much. But afterwards, he became a popular playwright and a shareholder at the Globe Theatre, and this was during his big time. And then, unfortunately, he died on his birthday in 1616, possibly from typhus. It just says that he died of fever. But that could be a number of things during Elizabethan period. Alright, so as for The Tempest, what's interesting about this play is that it differs from his usual plays because there's no dominant source material. He usually worked off histories, as we know, or mythology, or he was a big fan of the very early days of England. But this play in particular seems to have no one source. He may have borrowed from bits and pieces, but they haven't been able to find it all in one. It was written later in his life, around 1611 or so, and it was one of 14 plays created for the celebration of King James's daughter's engagement. This is considered one of his romance plays because it combines elements of his comedies and tragedies and of those tropes that we see in each one. And his romance plays also tend to dig deeper into character development, and they also require special effects. Now, back in the time when this play would have been performed, it would have been difficult to portray the thunderstorm, the storm at sea at the beginning of this play. I actually included in the module under the helpful links there is a production. It was the opening scene of a production of The Tempest at the Globe Theatre. Now it's of course a modern staging, but it's interesting to see how they would have done the special effects during that time period. And as for The Tempest, as the story itself, the island that everything occurs on is believed to be in the Mediterranean, And another thing that's interesting too is Prospero, our main character. He does do a lot. Of course, he's all in magic and sorcery, and he read from a book to learn these things. But he's careful to distance himself from what black magic, which is usually talking to the dead, using the dead to predict the future, and that was frowned upon in Elizabethan times. But not all magic was. So it's interesting to keep that in mind as you read the play. This play, The Tempest, also differs from Shakespeare's other plays because all the action occurs on one island in one day. Usually Shakespeare's plays cover a span of time, and usually we are pretty much all over the region, whether it's Italy, like Romeo and Juliet, or Rome for some of the, like Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. But this play, what's unique is that it's in one area just for one day. Another thing that's unique about this play is that it has an unusual amount of stage directions. Because usually in his plays, which was usually what most plays did at the time, was that there were minimal in-text stage directions. So you may see through your reading, you'll see something like Lady Macbeth enters, if you were reading Macbeth. But you usually will see like Prospero enters or someone exits. What's interesting though is that in The Tempest, there are more stage directions than Shakespeare usually used. That has been suggested that they were added by someone else, but he could have just been trying a new thing. I mean, it was one of his last plays. He might have been getting tired of those minimal directions. All right, so I hope that helped you get a little bit more background info about Shakespeare himself and the play, and offered you some things to keep in mind as you read.